Okay, so I'm Jim Collins, and my colleague and I, Olivier, who you've already met, would like to co-lead the discussion. And the best way to start that is for us to get a sense of what you would like to talk about. In other words, how do we do justice to this film by getting a sense of what you think is important about it, what you think is shocking about it, what you would like to hear more about. How do we unpack this film and try to make sense of it? In the sense of, Olivier has made the connections, I think, quite brilliantly between what the Black Lives Matter movement and the idea of the George Floyd film, and then what we see here with drone and the camera as the person as, the prosthetic camera. I think there's a lot there we can do with that. But I would also want to get a sense of what you would all like to add to that discussion. So I want to spend the first few minutes kind of setting the agenda of how we want to talk about this film. So please, Kara.
So I found one scene to be particularly significant, at least to me, when Chris said to Greaser, at least this is how we call him, remove your orange arm thing, because it's obvious that everybody knows that we are cops. But was it really obvious? So they didn't wear a uniform, their car was not a police car. So when it comes, and of course their behavior, when it comes to brutality, I think that the boundary between policemen and criminals blurs. So I found this ambivalence very striking.
I don't know if everyone heard that. Kara was saying that what she found interesting about the film was the ambivalence, the kind of the fluidity between, the criminal behavior, and then, law enforcement seems to be engaging in another kind of criminal behavior. And so the sense of just, am I doing justice to what you're saying? We see it in a lot of American films. You see bad cops, good cops, that kind of thing. And you see that even within the squad car, the range there. But in terms of, what we think of as criminal behavior, that's all over this film. And I think we need to, pursue, what, for me, the very end of the film, the quotation from Victor Hugo, you can use that to read back through the film, all right? And I think somebody asked me this afternoon, why would, why would an American audience learn something from this film? Would they learn only about what's happening in the suburbs of Paris? Or might they learn something about what's happening all over America at the same time? And that's a question that in this class that I'm teaching that we keep coming back to, all right? What can we say about these films that it is direct commentary on Denmark or France or Italy? But then how do these films also speak to global issues? And then, in effect, there is a kind of globalization. And I think that globalization factor, that this film is both global and intensely local at the same time, is one of the most interesting things about it. So we want to come back to this notion of criminality and globalization. Yeah, Alexis.
I'm interested in kind of the morality and kind of thinking about the globalization and specifically the global themes of kind of, we see it today, of placing the blame on someone else, kind of telling someone else when you've kind of messed up, never admitting that you're sorry and kind of instead being like it was the other person's fault, which I think is kind of cross-cultural. But also the way that the film frames the emotions and kind of focuses on the facial expressions and the eyes of the characters to kind of question whether the characters truly believe the blame they're putting on the other characters when that happens.
Yeah, did everybody hear that? That one of the most important things that this film does, in effect, keep coming back to is, where do you lay the blame? What's causing this problem? What are the factors that cause this problem? And I think, to go along with what Alexis was saying, this scene where you have that kind of Mexican standoff, all right, where Chris wants the kid back, you've got the Muslim Brotherhood, you've got the good cop, you've got the bad cop, you've got the other, neighborhood, apparently kind of the king of the underworld, you've got the mayor, and in fact you've got a kind of microcosm of all these different people, all looking at each other with intense hatred, all in effect blaming each other. And I think that gets worked out visually in the film in a lot of interesting ways, but also in terms of narrative situations, where, in effect, who is the most guilty? Who, in effect, if there can ever be anything like justice in the world, how could that be accomplished if everyone's blaming each other? Okay? Yeah.
What I thought was kind of interesting is how they kind of think about the human aspect of it, because how they show it when at the later stage of the film when they all go home after the first day,
Yeah.
and just how the director really purposely put that all in there to kind of think about how they unwind and how each one of them kind of reacted to the day.
That's a really now. I think that's a really pivotal sequence because, for me anyway, so much of the film depends on making you feel like you're there, right in the middle of the action. All right, and in visual terms, so much of this film is handheld, and there's also very short takes, and you're cutting back and forth between it's called shaky cam. All right, so the camera in effect creates this kind of the effect where you almost get kind of seasick after a while because all of the takes are so short, and it's cutting between moving cameras. But in that sequence, what I think is so interesting about it is when you see them all go home to their respective spaces, the film suddenly kind of calms down, and it also goes out wider, and then you get a sense of, yeah, we want the viewer to participate in the action and get a sense of this chaotic, situation. But the film is also you mentioned the human factor here. I mean, it really wants to give us a sense of, this is what all of these people go home to. And there, at that point, the camera in effect steps back, you get, wider shots, longer takes, the music changes. And so it's as if there's this kind of moment in the middle of the film where you have this kind of very frenetic cutting, and then you have this moment of relative calm, and then the film kicks into, by the end, you're really, in a combat film. I mean, it's not just, a gang violence film. I mean, you're really in the world of like Hurt Locker or something like that. And I think that kind of transition is really important. But as you say, I mean, in many ways, that middle point there, where we see all of these characters in their respective worlds, again, it seems to me to connect right to the quotation from Victor Hugo at the end, that there aren't bad people, all right? There are bad cultivators, mauvais cultivateurs. And I think, what do you think of that final shot? Where, in fact, you've got one kid with a Molotov cocktail and a cop with a gun, and the film ends there. I mean, that's a pretty provocative ending in and of itself. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I was going to say something about the end, but not directly commenting on it. That is, I study history, and the French historians has been studying the carnival act that existed in French history, like in revolutionaries, the celebration of revolutions and the cat massacres in early modern times. And that reminds me of the similarity, or I think that's what the director tries to. The film starts with the celebration of France winning the World Cup and ends with the Mexican standoff. And it was the same people that's being the main actor of both scenes, but they are in a status of completely oppressed silence during the other scene. So so it seems that this he seems to be suggesting that the carnival act at the beginning and at the end are the same, and they are here because they are being oppressed. It is their only way of trying to express themselves.
I think that's a really important point about, what are the terms of the oppression here? And, how does the film, start with this celebration of Frenchness? Not only the first shot you see, the kid's walking around with the tricolor around his like a kind of cape. And then you see the Eiffel Tower, the Tour Eiffel, and you're singing the Marseillaise and all that. But then Les Miserables comes up, and immediately Victor Hugo is invoked as, this in Montfermeil is where he wrote the novel. All right, so there's a sense of that connection that then comes back again at the end, which I think is really interesting. But again, why this novel? And it seems to me that, most people know Les Miserables because of the Broadway show. And I think that's a kind of misunderstanding. I mean, people. I mean, I don't want to say that if you like that musical that you're a bad person. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. On the other hand, I wouldn't say that I guess, in a very peculiar way, I think this is a much better adaptation of Victor Hugo's novel than the musical. Even though you have characters named Jean Valjean and Cosette and all that, I think this is closer to what Victor Hugo wanted to say in the 1860s, in the sense that he said, the primary conditions of misery in the modern world are poverty and a judicial system gone mad. And the novel keeps coming back to this kind of judicial system that has just gone mad, but also the subjugation of women, the subjugation of everyone by the terms of poverty. And it seems to me, if you're talking about a judicial system gone mad and what happens to people when they're impoverished generation after generation, this seems to me very close to the heart and soul of that novel. Because in effect, if we are going to fix the blame and try to figure out the conditions that produce this, the police as a representation of, and as the embodiment of a judicial system, which seems to be completely inadequate in terms of addressing these issues, where in effect there's poverty and there's a judicial system which in effect simply don't connect in any kind of meaningful way, which in fact gets back to the, how do we understand the terms of, what's happening here? Yeah.
And I feel like if we're going to talk about the terms of the oppression, we have to talk about the Lion Cub metaphor and the lion in general.
Yeah, please.
Of that, the lion has this power, and it's only here and caged because of this unnatural world it has been placed in, and doesn't belong there. And we see in the end, and also in Les Miserables, that there is this revolutionary idea from the little people, so to speak.
Yeah, did everybody hear that? I mean, the scene in the lion cage, I think is an amazing scene in this film because, in effect, it becomes a torture scene, and that you have, what we do with that in terms of just, is that the entire film writ small? All right, and in fact, these people are caged, and there is this sense of, of not just menace but death, all right, within the cage. Because so much of this film is all about being contained and trapped in spaces, and then at the very end of the film, they're all trapped in this kind of like maze, this warren, where they're just, throwing hell at each other. But in fact, they're all trapped and they're trying to get out of this building. Yeah.
The mention of the lion reminds me that Greaser's apartment, the moving boxes had lions on them, and kind of he's in a similar situation where he feels trapped by his environment, and kind of his supervisor is stopping him from kind of living out his job in the way that he would otherwise.
I think you're absolutely, and that's what I like so much about your comment, is in making that connection, it reveals just how really sophisticated this film is. It feels like it's kind of shot on the run, and everything is kind of being improvised for the camera, but it's actually an incredibly carefully made film in the sense that it wants to maintain that sense of organic spontaneity, but it's not just sort of one damn thing after another. I mean, the film, the very fact that in terms of its visual pacing, when it goes from, short takes to longer takes, when the music changes, it's really masterful in terms of how he masters the craft of trying to, on the one hand, create a sense of chaos, but doing that in such a controlled way, which I think is really quite amazing. Olivier?
Yes. Okay, this is absolutely fascinating. And I think if I could say one thing among the millions of things that I would like to add to the discussion, it is extremely interesting that we're having this discussion about the lion. And also, not the lion, right, the big lion in the cage, but the cub also. Because the cub has something in common with Isa. It is the fact that we get to know Isa extremely well when we watch the film, but he barely says maybe like 5 words, right, during the course of the film. One thing about the context here, this is highly cultural. There is something about the back, right? The back is this small squad, this small team of police officers that is translated into SCU. And I don't exactly know what that stands for in the United States, but in France, the back has a long, controversial extremely bad reputation. This reputation is tied to the colonial history, right? And so, you know, the history of the back, right? Those small units, is that these units were created during, I think, during the time of colonization, in order to harass, to apply pressure, all kinds of pressures, right? And the kinds of pressures that we see in the film also, that is, you know, scaring people, that is, all the things that Jim very eloquently explained also about how Victor Hugo's novel is about this mix, this explosive mix, right, of misery, poverty, right, and you know, a dysfunctional or oppressing judicial system, right? Well, in this context, the back is colonial, right, units that operated during the colonial empire in the colonies, and that were also like it's a way, it's a culture and a technique of controlling uncontrollable, right, subjects who are so oppressed that they have no way of expressing but revolting physically, like Issa does in the film, like the lion might do at some point. And so there's a book by a French anthropologist and historian named Mathieu Rigouste, right, who does the history, right, of these units that are still in France very controversial, but have been used by the French state in order to really police the suburbs, and more specifically, they are targeting black and brown subjects, right? And that's why I think in this context, bringing the metaphor, of course, this is an artistic invention by the filmmaker, but bringing the metaphor of the lion in this context is opening all kinds of colonial themes and imagery about how animality has been destroyed by colonization. As a reminder, the last lions of North Africa were killed by the French, right, in the 19th century. And the name of a city like Oran in Algeria, well, Oran means the lion, right? This is a reminder of the fact that the smell of the lion is absolutely everywhere in the city of Oran, where Camus, right? You know, The Plague by Camus takes place in this city of North Algeria, and so the north of Algeria. And so I think in the film there's this tension about, I think you said the word taming, right? This is not about, and they play it, the back plays it as such, like, yeah, we are, like they say in French, the proximity police, right? But they always remind their subjects that they are subjugated, that they are not in charge, when in fact this is a normal society. There are power relations in this society, but they will never say I'm sorry, and they are here to just not even track criminal activities, because they are a part of those criminal activities. As it's well depicted, it is quite clear at the beginning of the film that Chris is in business with at least two of the leaders of the housing project. It probably has to do with the nightlife, with drugs and stuff like that. So they are not higher, you know, but they are the ones who are here to oppress, right? And in this long history, I think the taming of the lion and the taming of this group of people, of the city, right, are two colonial themes that the filmmaker is playing with. By the way, he was born in Mali, a former colony of France. So the filmmaker. I mean.
Yes, please.
Excuse me, I just have one comment and a question. I wish Americans could make movies as compelling instead of Marvel Comics. My question is, you talked about the reaction in France, and the president, Macron, himself even had to say, well, I saw the movie, I was impressed. How did the police react to the movie?
That's a very good question. As far as I know, right, the police worked with the filmmaker extensively. One of the things is that the filmmaker really wanted to understand the police, but also to depict how close the population can be to the police. It's no accident that one of the 3 police officers was born and raised in the, in the city. So he's showing how that works. And what I think he's doing here is showing that, in spite of the proximity that we can see, right, between the 3 police officers and the population, there's always this thin layer that in fact is an abyss, right, between the police as an institution and the population. And I think like this abyss remains in largely relationships with the police in France. That is, after the release of the movie, there were all kinds of controversies over largely himself, because he's been filming them throughout the years. As I said in the introduction, he became a filmmaker because he was filming the police, like Buzz does. In fact, Buzz could be, an incarnation of the filmmaker largely himself, except that Buzz is using the drone and largely was using a small video camera. So it could be that Buzz, who's, I think, a very interesting character in the film, is the filmmaker, right? He's the filmmaker in the film, Buzz, right? But yes, I don't know how to interpret that, but there were all kinds of stories about Lajli's past that came up in the news, in the media, after the release of the film. And what I can say is that for the police, this is an interesting film, but they still have this antagonist relationship to cinema, to filmmakers, to journalists, you see what I mean? And that's why also at the head of the state, of the French government, it is important for the French president to let, to let people know that he's seen the film, that is, that he's received the message. But at the same time, I think the film is also showing something that was extremely controversial over the past years, which is the use of this LBD gun, that is like this bullet that hits Issa's face. Because for Emmanuel Macron, you know that it's one of the worst blood stains in his presidency, that there were so many demonstrators of the Yellow Vest movement that lost eyes, hands, and life, due to the use of this very lethal. It is a lethal weapon. It could have killed Issa, right? Obviously. So I'm not an expert, so I cannot tell you more about Lajli's relationship to the police. But I think like this boundary between the police and the people is also something that affects the way Lajli films this film. The thing he's said publicly as a filmmaker is that he always wanted to humanize them.
Yeah, that's
which is something that is truly interesting in the context.
Yes, he's successful in that.
We've had a long history of bad and good, right, also, in French cinema, about the suburbs and about the police. So in a way, he's also showing police officers, one example, for example, one of the 3 police officers is black, right? One example, this is a sociological thing. Anytime there's been a terrorist attack in France, over the past 15 years at least, right? There was North African, or there was a police officer who was killed during those terrorist attacks, whose family was not from France originally, to put it that way, right? That is, the parents were born in North Africa. For example, during the Charlie Hebdo attack in January of 2015. One of the police officers who's killed by the terrorists is from North Africa. Right? And so this is also the reality of the police in France today. Right? And so I think that he's depicting that. And in order to not fall in the dichotomy of like bad versus good, he's putting the black police officer in the film in the position of being the one who shoots, right, Issa. And I think that was well received in France because it's the reality. And that doesn't mean that the back, this police unit doesn't have this colonial history and so forth. And by the way, the colonial empire in France used, colonized subjects in order to control other colonized subjects, right? This is something that we see in the long history of colonialism, right? But especially the French version, they were specialized in this, right? Using native people in order to control other native people, right?
Yeah.
Just going back to the end scene, I just wanted to say that I really liked how the film ended on a very ambiguous note with the kid holding the Molotov and cop holding the gun, kind of just looking at each other. And I felt personally that one of the functions that this serves is to kind of remind us that this problem that we see throughout the film is ongoing, and that the police brutality and police corruption has yet to be resolved throughout the film.
And I think it's a really important point in terms of this humanization aspect, because in effect this film is an indictment. But then to get back to this notion of the last quote, that it's really not about bad people, it's about bad people who've been cultivated badly because of circumstances, because of the soil that they've grown up in terms of how they've been mistreated and all that. But to go along with your point, what I think is so interesting is that in effect what sets up the final quotation is the exchange of point of view shots. That in effect we're looking down at the cop from Issa's perspective, and we're looking at Issa from the cop's perspective, but neither of them is privileged. I mean, they're both given integrity. And so that before it fades to black, in effect you have looked through the eyes of both Issa as well as the cop. And there's no sense that one is inherently evil and the other one is inherently good. And I think it's a very brave move on the filmmaker's part to end with an exchange of point of view shots, I like, because it would be much easier and much more, in effect, schematic to have one person kill the other, or to have the whole thing blow up, or there are ways that you could provide a much neater narrative closure that would give you a much easier kind of moral lesson, and in fact the film refuses that. I mean, it doesn't want to refuse to, in effect, engage what are the moral issues here, but it doesn't want to moralize in a simplistic way.
Yeah, talking about that, I mean, for me, that last scene between Issa and the cop, there's a recognition. I mean, he actually stops Issa because, unlike when Issa went up to the mayor, I mean, Issa just knew what he needed to do to that mayor. But because the cop had actually seen Issa and helped him, for me, it's an incredibly moving ending, that there's a recognition between the two of them that they were people in some way.
They recognize themselves.
Yeah.
They see in each other an individual, not a class or not an occupation, but rather that they are individuals. And in effect, there is at least a prospect of some kind of connection. Greg?
Yeah.
So I agree with that, but I also think that at the end there's this recognition that Issa himself has been transformed by this violence, and the last individual or being that the police officer had pointed his gun at prior to that final scene was to the lion. And then we fast forward and we see that Issa himself is no longer a cub, but capable of the similar type of violence as the lion. And then the other sort of question that I have for the group, which I found quite interesting, is there were a number of instances where there was dialogue about the importance of watching out for your neighbor, watching out for your team. We have this moral obligation to our neighbor. And we have so many microcosms throughout this film, and I almost wonder, is it also trying to get us to rethink what our definition of neighbor should be beyond the bounds of generational or vocational and so on?
Exactly. What would it mean to form a meaningful community? I think that's
Yeah.
a really important question. It sounds like you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to this gentleman's comment because towards the ending of the film, what I found, I just can't talk with this, what I found just elegant and beautiful is the boy who was shooting the drone, he was behind the door and very subtly locks. So he is watching, but he is just not. And so to your point, we are neighbors to watch each other, but yet we're observing and doing nothing and removing ourselves. And that dichotomy, to me, and that shifting was just elegant.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Adding on to the points about the ending, I found it really powerful, especially the long shots just on Issa, and how the camera like wouldn't move away, and we just had like that really long shot at the end, and it really made, I felt like the audience think a lot about all the events that had led up to that point. And then I thought it was a really interesting choice by the director to like cut the movie right there and leave it so unresolved. Because I feel like at that point there was so much action and we were right in the middle of like such an intense fight scene at the end.
Yeah.
And then to like leave it off at that point and then with the quote, I thought that was a really interesting ending and like really made me like think a lot about like what actually happened and like consider the impact of the movie.
Yeah, I think that's, a really insightful point, because in fact it does keep you thinking about, because there is no simple narrative closure, I think you keep working on, the film keeps working on you. I mean, you keep thinking about, in a way, I think that's the most powerful kind of film about this, because it makes us ask these kinds of questions, all right? Well, what would it mean to try to fix that situation? What is ethical behavior in that way? What would a meaningful community be? And in fact, the film doesn't offer any easy answers to that, but on the other hand, it at least gives us a sense of, if we have a better understanding, even at the level of the guy with the Molotov cocktail in his hand. I mean, you see this kid who I think is really, Grant's point, very important. I mean, we've seen him come of age, and when he's got the Molotov cocktail in his hand, think about the number of images we saw during Black Lives Matter summer of rioters, and they were rioters, and they were framed as rioters. And in a sense, given what we've learned about this kid up to this point, really, could he be otherwise? I mean, it doesn't mean that he necessarily has to become a murderer by throwing a Molotov cocktail, but that sense of rage at a system which is seemingly just completely out of control, which has done nothing but violence to his body, has done nothing but torture him. For him to even pause for a moment, and in fact not throw the bomb, all right, I think is itself really significant. Yeah, Greg?
I think to the point of him not throwing it, I kind of interpreted the ending a little bit differently, I guess. So I'm in a class about resilience, and we talk a lot about institutionalized oppression and that kind of thing and how people respond to it. And something that I noticed is that at the end, when we see the cop with the gun, there's fear there, and it's clear. And then when you see Issa, he's still, he's not moving, and he seems much more set. Kind of just, doesn't seem to be the same fear that you see in the cop, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then I think to the point of him not throwing it, to me, it almost felt like for him that was like a reclamation of power in that moment, just for and that's why does he pause? Because to have that span of time where he has the control, I think that's what made it so powerful to me. And also why possibly the director chose not to end it differently.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, you've touched on something that is really important, which is the integrity that's given to that character's decision in terms of the pause. and that he has the means to, blow everybody up, but then stops. And what does that mean about his own resilience, I think, is a really interesting way of thinking about this. I mean, what is the takeaway from this film? And, what are we supposed to be learning about these people? That in fact, if they are victims, as it were, of bad cultivation, of a bad, set of circumstances. Does that mean they have no agency? Well, no. It seems to me that we do get the possibilities of agency here.
Oh, yeah.
That it's not just the sense of all of these social forces are oppressive and then it turns people into monsters. There's still the sense of people who are trying to do the right thing, as it were. And even with the range of cops, you've got, very interestingly, it's not just the bad cop and the good cop. You've got the completely corrupt cop. You have the stranger in a strange land who's come from the country, who is still trying to figure out how this world could have gone so crazy, and why the police are the worst criminals of all, or at least seem like it. And then you've got the guy from the neighborhood. And that, in and of itself, the fact that you get such three very different kinds of cops, I think has a lot to do with then asking questions about what does it mean to be resilient in a world that seems to be so dysfunctional, and a judicial system that seems to be so dysfunctional, and poverty that is ingrained now for generations. What would successful agency, even as an emergent category, what would that look like?
I just wanted to return to the parallel between the beginning and the opening and the end. I think that one of the things that the film engages with is the issue of national unity, which is something that is very particularly important and also controversial in Europe as a whole. Because we saw that the film opens with the celebration for the World Cup, and this is something that happens, for example, in Italy, that to feel this sense of belonging and unity only when there is a soccer game. Otherwise, we're pretty divided socially, politically, and the next day of a game, that sense of fraternité is gone. And throughout the movie, this sense of fraternity is really strong between the police. They mention all over this, many times, this sense of team, équipe. It's all about the keep. And this returns to the end, I think, when we have these two two teams facing, we find that there is actually a correspondence instead of a dichotomy, as we said.
I really like that point. I mean, I don't know if everybody heard that or not, but the sense that there is this national unity, but the national unity only, in effect, is a product of following the World Cup, and that the country comes together, sings the Marseillaise together, and then a day later, everything goes back to this very factionalized, situation where, in effect, national unity of any kind seems to be impossible, because, in effect, by the time we get to the end, there are just these warring teams. There is the cop team, and then there's the team from, the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's the team of the drug runners, and there's this other team. And, the term équipe, the team, that in fact that your affiliation gets back to Grant's point, the sense of being, what you affiliate with, all right, and how those affiliations become part of that factionalization. And does that become, on the one hand, the only thing that gives you any sense of belonging, but then how does that become pernicious if it's your team, in effect, has to declare war on all of the teams? And then is there ever any sense of a national unity that might emerge out of that? Or is it just endless factionalization, which begins to sound a lot like the United States? All right, anyway, yeah.
For me, it was also quite interesting the accents of women. Or women were behind doors, women were in kitchens. It was just that one scene at the bus stop with the young girls, but that this was all men. This was men's world, even the soccer. I don't know the novel. I have never read Les Miserables. So I don't know how important women were in the story.
That's a good question. I mean, I think they're important. There's I wouldn't say that it's a feminist novel as such, but or even a proto-feminist novel. But on the other hand, when in the preface to Les Miserables, I believe he talks specifically about the subjugation of women, and that's another, in effect, product of poverty and a judicial system where in fact there is no sense of justice. But he mentions, as one of the detrimental effects of this, he mentions specifically this education of women. But you're right. I mean, women do not have major roles in this film. But then again, I think to suddenly create a character that would, in effect, try to balance that out, I think would feel kind of too contrived in this film. If anything, it's more an indictment of this macho bonding, which just keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
I think oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go, please.
Yeah, this is kind of separate, but I was just struck by the image of the fire on the Molotov cocktail, and it was reminding me of the story. I think it was Issa who was telling the story of the person who was burned after stealing something, and then he was in that position to like potentially burn the people who had hurt him. So I thought that was really interesting of like how he was on the two different sides of that image as well, and kind of like it's kind of putting them in the same place of like the extreme arbitrator of justice.
And I think that's so interesting that he's able to play that. Well, he's given that function in the narrative, even though he's a kid who, in effect, becomes so invested with all of these circumstances. I mean, he's a really interesting character because, in fact, he becomes the embodiment of so much, and that seems to be so contradictory. That's really.
I think also really important for like that dichotomy with the fire is I feel that that's really representative of the change in Issa, because at least how I read the first story of the fire was I didn't see that as something that actually happened, especially when he's talking about like the ashes blowing away in the wind. It seemed just like a kid trying to act tough and impress his friends, but then at the end he's actually has this power and is like more stuck in this world as opposed to before where he was just kind of a bystander.
Olivia, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking about, since you're talking about the fire, by the way, I'm thinking about what sets the society in fire, right? I mean, what is it that makes, that goes from one incident, and in this case, it's police brutality, right, to a broader social movement. And I think, like, I mean, the film is made in 2018, and when Jim was addressing how globalized this topic is in the film and how it talks to us here in the US, of course it's made before the social movements that take place and in a way civil rights movement that takes place in the US after after George Floyd was killed. What's interesting here, I think, is that largely there are countless references to the riots that took place in Clichy-Montfermeil, which is Montfermeil and Clichy-sous-Bois, right, are the two cities that are very close, where Lajli grew up, right? And when he was in his 20s in 2015, he was 2005, sorry. He was born in 1978, so you can count. He witnessed the riots in his city. And I think he's revolving around this question on what sets a society, a city, a nation on fire, and what does that fire mean, and how do you interpret this? And I think that the final scene is also the embodiment of that, when you have a little kid. I mean, I don't know how old he is, but he's like 12 or 13. He's not old, right? But he's in a position of force. He's on a higher, step in the staircase than the police officer, and he's obviously the one who has the scepter, right? He's in power. He's in charge, right? He's the sovereign on this scene, and I think like what interests Victor Hugo is Victor Hugo, as a reminder, who starts his life and his career as a very conservative, man, politically speaking, and who's not at all a revolutionary person until he witnesses the revolution of 1848. And that's when everything changes in his mind. And that's when he becomes, which is rare, right? He goes from the right to the left, even the far left in his life. Typically, it's the opposite, right? That happens. People go from the left to, even, more and more conservative as life, goes. But in the case of Victor Hugo, it's the opposite. And it is the opposite because, like Lajli, in a way, he's observed the revolution of 1848, and that was a complete transformation in his mind. And I think that this is what makes Victor Hugo the artist, but also a kind of a revolutionary artist, in the sense that he both witnesses the collapse of a society, of a social order, and also how, like the kids in this film, set the city on fire, create a riot. This is the beginning of a big riot that's going to be everywhere in the news, sure enough. But at the same time, the kids are taking over. And they are no longer, caught in this system of factions like you very well described, Jim. But they are all together. I mean, what they pull out is an ambush that was extremely, extremely well planned. And they dominate all the factions and all the adults in this society, in this city, in less than like 10 minutes, right? In 10 minutes, they take over. And this is what fascinates Victor Hugo with the 1848 movement, because these are people who are not organized in some ways, right? But they very suddenly become a collective intellectual that is one of the most powerful subjects in history in the 19th century. And that's Les Misérables, right? And I agree with Jim. This is the complete opposite of the Broadway show that we are seeing here. But this is very, very close to Les Misérables by Victor Hugo in this way, that he's filming what he's experienced himself as a 20-year-old guy who witnesses how kids will trigger the riots of 2005. So I think that's a very interesting metaphor, like that of the fire at the end. Right?
Also, well, I know it is a bit of a stereotype, but there's a sense of revolutions is really core to the French identity.
Yeah.
And I think really important with that is we have this sports metaphor in the beginning, and at the end, as they light up the Molotov and Issa walks through the crowd, I can't say like how explicitly it was meant to be, but it had, for me at least, I had this image of like the Olympic torch being passed and him running through with that, and does this like big national event again coming through this revolution.
It's a different kind of sporting event at the end there. Yeah. Anyone other comments? Well, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. We really appreciate your comments, and thank you for coming.